Aristotle places Megalopsychia in Book 4 of his Nicomachean Ethics, right after his treatments of courage, temperance, generosity, and magnificence. And the placement itself matters here, because the virtue he is about to describe is not just another one on a list. Megalopsychia, which translates literally as greatness of soul, belongs to a different order from the virtues that come before it. There's a line in Book 4 where Aristotle calls it a kind of cosmos of the virtues, so an adornment or a crown that makes all the other virtues greater. And he says that it cannot arise without them. In other words, Megalopsychia isn't a virtue we can have alongside the other virtues. It is actually what shows up when the other virtues are already present in us, and it expresses the character that this full formation produces. Now, as just mentioned, Megalopsychia literally means greatness of soul. So, not greatness of achievement and also not greatness of reputation. What it actually points to is the greatness of the inner thing that achievement and reputation actually come from. And this precision matters here because Megalopsychia isn't really about what a person has done or about what others think of him. Megalopsychia is more concerned with what he actually is and how he stands in relation to what he is. So the prior virtues in the Nicomachean Ethics each answer a very specific question about how we ought to live. Courage tells us how to respond to fear. Temperance tells us how to handle our appetites. Generosity tells us how to use our wealth, and magnificence tells us how to make grand expenditures. Each one gives us an account of a very specific domain of life and what excellence within this domain looks like. But none of them tell us what to do with our own excellence or how we should think about it once it is actually present in us. And this question obviously won't really be relevant for someone who hasn't yet developed the virtues. It only really starts mattering once they are already formed and once they are already excellent. In other words, Megalopsychia isn't really concerned with one more area of life sitting alongside the other areas. It is more concerned with the whole person once the formation itself is complete. What it does is it asks how someone who has actually become excellent should stand in relation to his own excellence. Because a person who has developed courage and justice and generosity and temperance over many years, this person has produced something real in himself. And this relationship to that reality is itself a matter of virtue or vice. He can either see it accurately or he can see it inaccurately. He can either claim what his character warrants or he can claim more than he deserves. Or, of course, he can claim less than he deserves. And the virtue of getting this exact thing right is what Aristotle calls Megalopsychia. And there's a specific reason Megalopsychia comes right after magnificence in particular. Magnificence is itself a virtue that is concerned with greatness, specifically with the right way to make grand expenditures in civic life. But Megalopsychia extends this concern with greatness inwards. In other words, magnificence is about the external scale of what someone produces, while Megalopsychia is about the internal scale of the person that is actually producing it. But the virtue also can't be pursued directly. You can't one day wake up and decide that today I'm going to become a great-souled man. You can't adopt the posture and the bearings of the Megalopsychos as some kind of stylistic preference or choice. The virtue itself only appears when the formation is actually genuinely present. And what this essentially means for us is that the only real path to Megalopsychia is the same path that is also required for the other virtues, which is the patient development of character through habituation. It is the refinement of judgment and also the exercise of our capacities across all of the different situations of our own lives. So, if Megalopsychia is what shows up when the virtues are present and formed in someone, then the next question is, what does it actually look like? And here's what Aristotle says. The great-souled man is the one who claims much and deserves much. And both parts of this have to be true at the same time. Now, the reason both parts matter is that the virtue lives in the relationship between them. A man who deserves much but claims little, this man isn't a Megalopsychos. In this case, his self-estimation is wrong. But a man who claims much or a lot but doesn't really deserve it, this man isn't Megalopsychos either. Since in this case, The self-estimation is also wrong, just in the opposite direction. Instead, the actually great souled man is the person in whom the actual worth and the acknowledgement of that worth line up exactly, which means that what he claims for himself and what he genuinely merits are the same thing. In Book 4 of his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle tells us that the Megalopsychos is an extreme in respect of the greatness of his claim, but a mean in respect of its rightness, since he claims what accords with his merits. So the virtue is extreme in scale and the claim is great, but it's a mean in its accuracy because the greatness of the claim matches exactly what is actually there. So the great souled man isn't moderate in what he claims, since he claims much, but what he is moderate in is about whether the claim actually corresponds to reality, which it usually does, because his character is in fact that great. Now there's something in Aristotle's framework that we have to pause on for a moment here. You have to understand that Aristotle isn't democratic about excellence. He thinks that when someone has actually formed the virtues through years of sustained work, when their judgment has been refined through lived experience, and when their character has actually become the stable orientation that his ethics describe, then this person is in fact more worthy than someone in whom this formation hasn't yet concluded. He thinks that the full realization of human capacity can and will produce genuine superiority. And this isn't a moral failing in a person that hasn't yet done the work. It is simply a description of what arete actually produces. Virtue, for Aristotle, is real and it makes a difference. And the person in whom this is present differs from the person in whom this isn't present. This is also why this particular virtue is so demanding, because it requires the Megalopsychos to see himself very accurately. He has to recognize the excellence that is actually present in him, without really inflating it and also without diminishing it. And this kind of accurate self-perception is itself a form of practical wisdom. It is phronesis that is applied to one's own character. The person who sees himself clearly can claim what he deserves, because he knows what he deserves. And the person who sees himself less than clearly, whether in the direction of inflation or in the direction of self-diminishment, this person falls short of the virtue, because the virtue requires accurate perception to ground the actual claim. Now, honor matters in all of this because honor is the primary external form that acknowledgement takes in Aristotle's account. And Aristotle is very specific in Book 4 that Megalopsychia is concerned above all with honor and dishonor, and with great honor in particular. He says that honor is the greatest of external goods because that is what we assign to the gods and to the most excellent men. So honor is the world's way of registering the presence of genuine virtue in a person. And the Megalopsychos, being the person in whom that virtue is most fully present, is the proper object of the highest honor. But the Megalopsychos doesn't actually chase honor. He doesn't really seek it as the highest thing or highest goal. Contrary to philotomia, which we talked about previously, Megalopsychia isn't about the governing of the desire for honor as a motivational force. Megalopsychia is about the relationship to honor, once the character that deserves it is already present in us. And that relationship is different in kind from what philotomia describes, because the Megalopsychos isn't driven by the need for honor anymore. He already has what honor actually tracks, which is the actual excellence honor is meant to acknowledge. Honor doesn't give him anything he doesn't already possess. It only registers publicly what is already true about him. So when honor comes to him from the right people, for the right reasons, he receives it moderately. He receives it as something that accords with his merits. And he isn't indifferent to it either, because honor from the virtuous is considered a genuine good. But he also isn't overjoyed because it doesn't really add anything to him. It only acknowledges what is already there. And when honor comes from the wrong people, or from the multitude, or for the wrong reasons, he treats that with something that is closer to indifference, because that kind of honor doesn't really track to his actual excellence, since it comes from the opinion of people whose judgment isn't really formed enough yet to actually know what excellence is. And a man who takes that kind of honor seriously would be taking seriously a judgment that isn't really worth taking seriously, so he doesn't take it seriously. So the Megalopsychos' relationship to external acknowledgement is more or less governed entirely by his own accurate perception of what he actually is. He doesn't need honor to know his own worth. He already knows it. In other words, for the great-souled man, honor is welcome when it comes from sources whose judgment he actually respects. And it is dismissed when it comes from sources whose judgment he doesn't respect. And this means that his interior state is stable in a way that the philanthromic man isn't. And there's one more nuance in this whole thing. Aristotle says that the Megalopsychos will be concerned with honor in particular, because honor is the external good that corresponds to his character. But he'll treat even great honor as less than the virtue itself, because nothing external can match with what the virtuous person has internally, since the excellence of his character is greater than any acknowledgement of it could ever be. And this is actually why the Megalopsychos can be moderate about honor rather than agitated by it, because he already possesses the thing that matters more than the honor bestowed. Now, Aristotle gives us two ways a person can get this virtue wrong, and he considers both vices. There is one that is an excessive vice, and there is a deficient vice. And the first is vanity. Vanity is basically empty-headedness, and it is the vice of the man who claims much but doesn't really deserve it. His self-estimation is basically inflated. He thinks himself worthy of great things when his character doesn't actually warrant it. And this is the more familiar vice of the two. We all recognize the vain man, and we recognize him easily. He's the one who demands acknowledgement that he hasn't earned. He's the one who positions himself to receive the honors his character can sustain, and who treats himself as if he were great when he in fact isn't great. His error is factual. He is wrong about what he is, and this wrongness is usually visible to others well before it is visible to himself. But the vain man, this man isn't actually bad in the way that some vices make a person bad. He is more ridiculous than vicious, since his claim exceeds his substance, and this disparity reveals itself in everything else he does. But the second error is a bit more different. This is what Aristotle calls Mikropsychia, so smallness of soul. Now, Mikropsychia is the vice of the man who deserves much but claims little. His self-estimation is deflated, and he sees himself as less than he actually is. And in Aristotle's mind, this is actually worse than vanity, and also more common than we tend to think. And the reason Mikropsychia is worse isn't obvious immediately. Most of us, we tend to think that claiming less than we actually deserve is a kind of humility. And humility is something that we have been taught to admire. But Aristotle doesn't really see it that way. In his account, the man who withdraws from himself what he actually deserves is committing the error of misrepresenting reality. In other words, the small-souled man, being worthy of good things, deprives himself of what he deserves or merits. And Aristotle says explicitly that this man seems to have something bad about him, because he doesn't think of himself worthy of good things. Aristotle isn't merely neutral about Mikropsychia. He thinks it is more destructive than vanity, because vanity, for all its ridiculousness, at least involves a kind of engagement that actually matters. The vain man, he wants honor. He wants the acknowledgement of his virtues. He wants the great things that the Megalopsychos actually deserves. His error is just that he thinks he deserves them while he doesn't really deserve them. But he is at least oriented toward the right objects. So his desires, even when they are misapplied, is for the genuine goods. And this means vanity can sometimes be corrected. The vain man, he can be educated. He can come to see that his claim exceeds the substance he actually has, and he can either do the work to bring his character up to standard, or he can just simply adjust his claim downward to match what his character actually is. So, there is essentially a path correction in Aristotle's mind. But Mikropsychia is different. The small-souled man has already done the work. In some sense, he has the character and he has the virtues, but he refuses to see them in himself. He withholds from himself the acknowledgement that his own character warrants. And this refusal isn't some innocent defect. Aristotle thinks that this cuts the person off the activity of virtue itself, because the activity of virtue includes the accurate perception of what oneself is. And by failing to perceive his own excellence, he also fails to act in accordance with excellence. He essentially pulls back from undertakings his character would actually support. He declines honors that would rightly belong to him, and he withdraws from the arena where his virtue would have his proper expression. And the result of all of this is that this person's virtues, though they are present in him, don't really fully do what virtues are supposed to do, which is to realize the full capacity of the person in whom they are present. Now, besides this, Aristotle also says that Mikropsychia is more common than vanity, which is a counterintuitive claim when you think about it, because we usually assume that the typical human failing in this account or area is overclaiming rather than underclaiming. But the way Aristotle sees it, people typically deprive themselves of what they deserve more than they claim what they don't, which runs directly against our modern instincts, let's say. We have kind of been educated to worry about arrogance, about pride, about claiming too much for ourselves. And a lot of us, even when we are in fact genuinely excellent, we tend to fail to see it. We downplay what we have done, we downplay our achievements and refuse honors we have earned. And we tend to treat our own achievements as if they were accidents, as if they belonged to someone else. And this pattern, which looks like humility from the outside, is what Aristotle treats as a vice, and a serious one at that. And the reason for this view should be clear from what we've just talked about. The virtue of Megalopsychia requires accurate self-perception. False modesty isn't a form of accurate self-perception. False modesty is a failure of perception in the direction of underclaiming. The small-souled man, he misrepresents himself. He says things about himself that aren't true, or he just simply declines to say things about himself that are true. And this misrepresentation serves no one. It doesn't make him more virtuous, neither does it make him more lovable. It just produces a gap between what he is and what he is willing to acknowledge about himself. And that gap is itself a form of dishonesty. Now, this doesn't mean Aristotle is endorsing the opposite of Mikropsychia as some general virtue, because the opposite is vanity, and as we already know, Aristotle condemns vanity. Megalopsychia doesn't mean that you claim the most you can. It means that you claim exactly what corresponds to what you actually are. If you are ordinary, then you claim accordingly. But if you are genuinely excellent, then you also claim accordingly. The test is the correspondence. The test is not the direction of the claim itself. So, what Megalopsychia is actually demanding of us is more than it appears, because the person of genuine excellence has to be willing to see and actually acknowledge his own excellence. He has to resist the pull towards false modesty. He has to claim what he deserves, even when claiming it feels uncomfortable, and even when it goes against what the surrounding culture says a person should do or shouldn't do. Now, in Book 4 of his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle gives us a portrait of the Megalopsychos in fairly concrete detail. He tells us that a Megalopsychos walks slowly, that he speaks with a deep voice, that he doesn't hurry, that he is hard to impress, because little impresses someone who has already met the full scale of his own character. He tells us that a Megalopsychos also doesn't remember small wrongs that are done to him, because those wrongs don't really register against the scale of what he is. He also speaks his mind openly, because he doesn't really fear the reactions of those whose opinions don't really carry any authority for him. He is also willing to use irony when dealing with ordinary people, because he recognizes that full honesty will be inappropriate in that context. The Megalopsychos also doesn't really do many things, and he acts only in great matters, but not in small matters. And finally, the Megalopsychos carries himself with measured reserve across all of it. Now, none of this is aristocratic affectation in Aristotle's account. It is just the natural expression of a man in whom the virtues are fully formed and who actually stands in accurate relation to that formation. The slow gait isn't a pose or a performance. It is just how someone actually moves around when he has no need to hurry and no need to prove anything to anyone. The deep voice isn't calculated. It is just the voice of someone whose speech comes out of settled conviction, rather than out of anxiety about how he is perceived by anyone else. And the refusal to admire small things isn't snobbery. It is just what happens when a person's inner scale has been set by his own fully developed character, and against that scale, most things others find impressive just simply aren't impressive to him. And when it comes to using irony with ordinary people, Aristotle's point here is that the Megalopsychos, who speaks the truth openly, with those who can understand or whose understanding matches his understanding, also recognizes that there are people whose understanding don't match his understanding. And with them, full honesty would be either wasted or cruel. So he uses irony, which is a way of speaking that adjusts to the listener without the speaker abandoning his own position. And this is actually a form of practical wisdom as Aristotle understands it. The Megalopsychos doesn't treat everyone the same because not everyone is the same. He adjusts his mode of speech or address to what the person in front of them can actually receive, while remaining entirely himself throughout the conversation. In other words, the Megalopsychos is someone who is genuinely self-contained. He is not withdrawn necessarily, and he is not aloof in the sense of being disengaged. He is simply grounded in his own accurate perception of what and who he is. And his relationship to the world is governed by that perception. He engages where the engagement is warranted by something real, and he pulls back from what doesn't really warrant his attention. And his conduct ultimately expresses at every point the exact match between his character and his acknowledgement of it. But the portrait Aristotle gives us here in his book 4 isn't really the main point. Megalopsychia isn't a style that can simply be adopted or mimicked. It also isn't a posture that can be simply learned and performed. Megalopsychia is a condition that either is present in someone or it simply isn't. And the condition depends entirely on whether the prior formation of the virtues is actually taking place. The man who doesn't have the character of the Megalopsychos can't simply imitate his way into having it. The slow gait, or the deep voice, if adopted without the character that is underneath, produces only a caricature or a mask. So the portrait Aristotle gives us here isn't really a set of instructions, and we shouldn't really understand it as a set of instructions. So what's actually being demanded of us here isn't that we work toward Megalopsychia directly. It is actually that we continue the ongoing work of every earlier virtue that has already been asked of us. The habituation, the development of hexes, the refinement of phronesis, and the sustained exercise of our capacities across the real situations of our own lives. Megalopsychia is what that work eventually produces in the person who sees himself accurately. Ultimately, the question for us isn't whether we have Megalopsychia or whether we can attain it. The question is whether that formation that produces it is actually on their way or not. We should ask ourselves whether the virtues are being developed, whether our judgment is being refined, and whether our character is becoming the stable orientation that Aristotle actually describes. Because if that work is happening, then the relationship to one's own worth will come into accurate alignment over time. But if that work isn't happening, then no amount of posturing or self-presentation or image construction will substitute for it. Megalopsychia is the mark of a character that has done what it is supposed to do, and it can't be produced or attained in any other way than that.